I don't know what came over me. You know, a moment that I can't recapture. Or we are sort of like left wondering whether this will ever happen to us again. Or again, we find ourselves comparative with more systematic thinkers. So what I want you to recognize is that your creativity is the natural flow from the way in which your brain operates. It's not some sort of mystical encounter. If your brain doesn't feel to you like it operates in a systematic way, which is probably why you're part of this particular group, creativity is like breathing air. So the way in which we function as creative people requires an outworking of that creativity. So if we deny ourselves the opportunity to be creative, and that isn't just artistry, we'll talk about what creative means soon, but if we deny ourselves the opportunity to be creative, we feel suffocated. And that's because for our minds, this flow of creativity is fundamental to how we live. Now, it might be frustrating for other people who are like, oh, why can't you just do X? You know, can't you just be a, you know, often the critique is, oh, you're not a completer finisher. Who's heard that phrase? Yeah, most people. Okay, so you're not a completer finisher because if you had real value, you'd be a completer finisher. Basically, the critique is, oh, well, you're just a sort of fluffy starter, but you haven't got the guts to make it happen. When actually creativity, giving birth to something, is what you do. That's the primacy of this kind of state of being. Now, what I want you to do is just chat to the person next to you for a couple of minutes. What do you resonate with sort of so far? What excites you about where you think this might be going? That's a creative question. You might be disappointed, but I want you to ask the person next to you, what excites you about where this might be going? Let's go and sit with Bella, and then she will talk to you. Okay. Sorry, it's my daughter, very directive. Okay, a couple of minutes. What resonates with you, and where do you think this might be going? Let's have some thoughts, comments, observations. We're a small crowd, so you can just shout out what you, any comments or observations. Laura, what are you thinking? Okay, nice to know other people feel like this. Okay, other things? Okay, great to know that other people get distracted and that's not necessarily problematic. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. And that's another part of this sort of mythology around creativity that Soy is referencing here, is that more systematic thinkers think that creativity is a kind of magic that they haven't got, when actually systematic thinkers can actually become more creative by recognizing that the same thing, there's the same cognitive tools you use to paint a masterpiece are also used when you're driving your car to the shops. It's literally that banal. That, you know, drive to the shops is the same tool psychologically that you're using to paint a masterpiece. And of course, there's as with all things, we can create a kind of mythology around it, which makes us look more precious and unique than we really are in this field. So the more mystery you create, the more unique you look. no creative who's successful wants to diminish the craft and make it look like anyone could do it. So there's smoke and mirrors on both sides, but I want you both to feel like you can be more creative, but also to recognize if you feel like this, that's totally okay, that's totally normal. Now, psychology around the idea of a left and right brain has actually become quite old hat, and new PET scanning has shown that this isn't really a useful model. But I wanted to kind of still use the idea, so this was sort of 80s psychology really, the idea that there was you're more right-sided in terms of being more creative, or left-sided in terms of more structural. In fact, actually our brains can't be divided in that kind of way. But objectifying creative frustration is quite helpful. By that I mean saying, this is how my brain works. And actually, rather than thinking along the lines of, I'm the problem, if you like, either I'm too creative or I'm not creative enough, actually thinking about the way your mind works is releasing. It is really helpful because, as I say, then you can use the tools at your disposal. And because the sort of narrative around creativity is so broad and so diffuse, you can think, well, I'm completely lost. How can I actually make a change? And within the work I do around anxiety, particularly obsessive compulsive disorder, blaming your brain can actually be quite good as a tool. Effectively identifying the thought problem, going, it's not me, it's my obsessive thought condition, for example, or it's not me, it's not a character deficiency, it's the way my brain works. So I've gone from comparative brain analysis, my brain is not as good as, to my brain frustrates me, but it works like this, versus, the problem is not me, the problem is, if you like, if there is a problem, the problem is the way in which my cognition functions. And the weird thing about these issues is that as you befriend them, which is the title of this talk, Befriending My Creative Mind, as you befriend them, they move from being problems to opportunities. So what's quite weird about this scenario is, in the room, say 80% of you have more chaotic and less systematic brains. There'll be a group of people who aren't in the room tonight who are thinking, oh, I'd love to go to that, but that's just not me. So they'd actually like more of what you've got, not less of what you've got. But we all compare, in terms of saying, well, I want to be more like X, Y, or Z. And this falls into what we describe as sort of loving my brain on purpose, which is remarkable. It'll wiggle your toes. Just everyone give their toes a wiggle. Had you thought about your toes up until that point? It's amazing, isn't it? Just think, you were completely oblivious to your wonderful toes, but you've just connected with them, and you've just given them a wiggle. Now wiggle your brains. It's hard, isn't it? It's funny that the way in which we perceive the world, this supercomputer up here, we can't really connect with it objectively. We can connect with other parts of ourselves. We can acknowledge other parts of ourselves, but we can't acknowledge the one thing that we perceive everything else with. And so we tend to fall into ourselves, again, making this personal rather than thinking about it more objectively. So loving my brain on purpose, this is a Swedish psychologist, Fredrik Ullin, and he says that creative people, like those with psychotic illnesses, tend to see the world differently to most. Creativity is uncomfortable. I found this really helpful. I don't suffer from psychotic illness, but I've definitely suffered from mental health illness in the past, particularly around anxiety. And I recognize that part of my creative brain, which enables lots and lots of threat-related thoughts, could connect with lots of threat-related thoughts because actually was very good imagining scenarios beyond the immediate. So non-worriers, I realized, tend to be very systematic, logical, and also present-time focused. So you're like, oh, so I'm saying, oh, I'm really worried about, nukes and a World War III. Really? Why are you worried about that? I mean, that's never going to happen. Yeah, but I'm kind of rolling out a scenario a year from now. They're like, well, why are you doing that? They can't kind of understand because they're so systematic and so present time orientated. So the flip side of worry, if worry is a negative process that leaves you spending the grace of today on the problems of tomorrow, the flip side is the creativity of being able to imagine something beyond yourself. Now, until I could acknowledge a benefit, if you like, to the cognitions around worry, worry is just a problem with no upside. But imagine if you could acknowledge that actually there's an upside to your brain's ability to perceive threat, which is your brain's ability to catch vision. Because actually that's what worry is. Worry is effectively negative vision. Imagine catching an upside and going, that's prophetic, or I see that, or I can imagine that. That then becomes visionary. So visionary is two sides of quite a complicated coin. The dark side is that you spend your time agonizing over things that will never happen. The upside is you might imagine something that could happen. Are you willing to make it your reality? So thinking about it from that side, recognizing that how creative you are has an upside, can really enable you to love your brain on purpose. And we know, obviously, historically, that lots of the world's finest creatives have struggled with mental illness. Probably Vincent van Gogh is the most famous. Me and the family went to Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam during, just at the summer after lockdown. It was amazing to see that many pieces of his artwork in place, in situ, because of course you get the overwhelming pieces like sunflowers or the bed in the room, but then you get this whole dark side on the fourth floor of this sort of depressive Van Gogh and the kind of bowed people and the kind of the dark palette, and you realize, okay, there are two sides to this person. There's a real struggle here in their creativity. So loving your brain on purpose can enable us, sorry, that's not a very good slide, it's just cut off there. So supporting our creative brain function is not just an awareness of its benefit and therefore beginning to befriend it. It's an active process. Your brain, as a creative person, tends to do really well with big building blocks: sleep, diet, exercise, and range. Now, most people's brains work quite well like this, but really systematic people have very little fluctuation in their brain function. What's really weird about people who function in a very, very orderly way is effectively they're normally doing 60 miles an hour, and it doesn't really go any other way, unless they're dog-tired, and then they might start slipping up with their words or kind of repeating themselves. Quite rare, but if you know anyone who's super systematic, it's like their brain is always on, it's always doing 58 miles an hour, which is the most economical way of driving, and doesn't really fluctuate. It doesn't get a lot faster, it doesn't get a lot slower, it just does what it says on the tin. Now, you could say that's wonderful, or you could say it's slightly boring, but it depends which side of the fence you are. The key thing is that consistency is king for the systematic thinker. But the creative thinker's brain fluctuates a lot more. So what you find is brain speed tends to fluctuate hugely for people who are more creative. And again, this links into some of the mental health stuff. You tend to find that thoughts accelerate or decelerate. You can have fast thinking and slow. There's actually a great book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. But you can get quite obsessive and quite kind of preoccupied. But also you can get quite forgetful and quite languid as well. So there's a lot more fluctuation in the way the creative thinker thinks in terms of brain speed, in terms of attention, and many of those are directly affected by some of these big building blocks. So if you're a creative who doesn't sleep very well, actually you can find that you're getting a lot more discomfort in terms of those fluctuations and find yourself sliding into daydreams during the day, more fantasy, getting disconnected from your circumstances, maybe losing your focus and being less productive. Diet definitely has an impact as well. And again, creatives tend to lean quite heavily on sugar. We'll talk about stimulants in a minute, but sugar, caffeine, alcohol, lots and lots of things that either break or accelerate that process of thinking. Exercise can have a really big impact on creative brain well-being because of two things really. One is the actual benefits of the exercise process, but one is also this experience of range. So as we exercise, moving into different space, we encounter what we call range, and range is external stimulus. So again, one of the key things about creatives is that they need to see different things in order to keep their brain connected. So not many creatives in accountancy, because looking at spreadsheets all day doesn't really do that for you. Lots of creatives in flexible working in different environments, getting out at lunchtime, walking along the river, going to a gallery, all of these kind of things. And systematics tend to find it quite overwhelming. Like, what do you do that for? Well, I get ants in my pants by about 11:45 if I haven't taken a walk outside, or I need to go and do something else in a different space. Who finds themselves moving into a number of different working environments? Yeah? And who feels that kind of twitchy, irritable, I gotta go? Yeah, okay, lots of us, okay. So it's totally normal, totally healthy, but it's because you're more connected externally and systematics are more connected internally. So if you think about this idea of being sort of plugged in, systematics tend to be more contained, they tend to think in more contained ways, they're more settled in themselves. Creatives tend to be more connected externally, and they're more affected by these external factors. The second building block is about social stimulation, social withdrawal, and solitude. And again, systematics can need these things in different measure. They can need social stimulation, and they can also need isolation, and they can also need, social withdrawal. But there'll be a lot more orderly about that in terms of saying, I just want some time of my own, or, I'd quite like to see some people, but it's quite a non-plus. We haven't been out for dinner for a while, why don't we go out for dinner? That's that kind of attitude. Whereas the creative is like, I really need to see someone right now. I really want to go out. Like, is there anyone around? Making loads of phone calls. Are you around? Like, where are you? What are you doing? Like, so that kind of sort of super urgency to connect. Equally, okay, I'm done. I can't see another person. So quite a lot of drama on the right. I'm totally like I've had it now. Like I just want to go into my cave and like just stay away from everyone. So kind of quite a boom or bust mentality. I can see a lot of people are resonating with this idea. Again, which can be quite confusing, especially if you're in a relationship and partners sort of the other way around, because they're like, oh my goodness, I don't know whether you want to see anyone or whether you don't want to see anyone. Or, like one minute I think we're going to go to a party, the next thing you just want to go into a cave or like go and walk in the hills. So this is like there's this kind of push me, pull you experience with external relationship. And again, it's because you're so connected externally versus being connected internally. So the way in which you're activated is environmental, whereas the systematics tend to be internally wired and internally referencing. That doesn't make them narcissistic, it just makes them very settled in themselves. And you can see why certain careers lean towards certain sorts of thinking mentalities, because actually it would be very difficult for some of us to do things so systematically and so with such longevity without blowing up. That's our kind of reality. The final one there in terms of supporting your creative brain function is about experience and reflection. So Pritchard and Bell particularly talked about a sort of corkscrew of learning. And this is about experiencing and then reflecting on our experience. And creatives, as they're dialecting their environment, require both an experience and an opportunity to reflect on their experience. So we try and make sense of the world that we're living in by reflecting on what we've gone through. Now, that's not to say, again, that more systematic thinkers don't reflect, but it's a necessity for creatives. So when you become kind of congested, you will find someone to talk to about that congestion. So we have this rising kind of feeling of like, can I just talk to you about that interaction I just had with your like mum? I just need to have a chat with you about that. And they're like, that was okay, wasn't it? Well, yeah, but just thinking about it, it reminds me of something that happened, 8 years ago that I remember really, really well. And it's got links to my childhood, and there's a painting of that. There's like The Scream by Edvard Munch, I think. You sort of create all this like Minority Report fabric of all this stuff from your history to dialect your experience. Whereas, again, systematic thinkers tend to be like, oh, that wasn't a great interaction, was it? I don't know, I didn't really feel great about that. And that will be almost as much reflection as necessary. So there's an urgency to reflect, and there is sometimes an urgency to create out of reflection. So why do creatives create? Well, they create because they're dialecting their experience. So when you create, the creation is coming out of a flow of stimulus. So you paint in response to your environment. I mean, you might paint abstract, but you're still painting in response to your experience, either internal or external. So, Van Gogh, I think, painted, when he was in Saint-Rémy-en-Provence, he was painting some 100 paintings a week. I mean, he was obviously manic, but he was literally painting, sketching, filling canvases. He was on fire. But every view, he was literally like going for it. And he was completely exhausted, of course. You can't knock out that much work without falling apart. But he was desperately trying to dialect his experience in the world by responding to what he was reflecting on. And you will all, to a level, if you're a creative, be trying to respond with reflection to your experience, and that is part of your journey to make sense of what you're going through. And it might be journaling, it might be doodling, it might be imagining, but it's a reaction to what you're going through. Now, I'd love you again just to chat to people around you about that process of experience and reflection. I'd love to hear back from some of you about the ways in which you do that, or if that's a revelation for you for the first time, I'd love to hear about that. So just take a couple of minutes to chat to the person next to you about how many of these you resonate with in terms of supporting your creative brain function that you didn't even know you were using as a support. Let's hear from a couple of you who sort of just, I mean, I'm sure you guys have all thought this through before, but does anyone just go, oh, does anyone feel like they really resonate with that idea of like external processing, connecting? Yeah, quite a few people. Yeah, great. Anyone want to add anything to what I've just said about the response, creativity as a response to dialecting our environment? Any, yeah, that's right. Really helpful, and you know, it's costly. There's a really helpful comment. Thank you so much, because it is so costly. Being creative is costly, and you know, the costs are time and emotion. Really, that we sort of, you know, we're struggling sometimes to process, to express, and yet it's such a necessary part of us staying well and healthy. I mean, I've spent some time in the therapeutic space. I think I spent 2 years doing psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is a long time to sit in a room with someone who basically doesn't talk to you. What it showed me was a few things. One was how much I had to say. You know, I think they expect you to talk yourself out within 3 months. I was definitely still going after 6 months. And I think he must have been a saint, who my analyst, because he was like sitting there, really? We're still going. Wow, he's still going. The purpose of psychoanalysis is that you almost, you know, they create a white wall, you throw your stuff onto the wall, you know, at the end of the day, you've kind of talked yourself out. You know, you've got to like the end, and that's when you can begin to do the work. But I was still going because I just so much in there to process and so much to keep kind of working through. But actually, when you catch up with yourself, it feels good and it's worthwhile. And that's again where this whole thing of loving your brain on purpose is so important, because others might diminish or sort of railroad your experience of life with a more expedient way of being. Like, oh, you know, we've got to just, the phrase I hear a lot is, you just got to move on. And you're like, I'd love to just be able to move on, but that's just not how I work. You know, that's not how my brain works. I've got a whole load of carriages behind me. I need to like sort them out, because these carriages are like driving me and I need to sort of unload. Life is not meant to be expedient. You know, that's one of the key things for you guys. It's like, there's not a faster way or a more efficient way of living. If you're creative, it's just not that efficient, but actually it's also beautiful. And so, you know, when you look at buildings like this, you know, here's a good example of someone who didn't try to find the most efficient way of building a building, but thought about the most glorious way of bringing glory to God. You know, nothing in our world that's beautiful has been created by someone who wanted to do things expediently. Like everything that's created that has beauty has been created with extravagance. And I like to think that God didn't create the world expediently. I know he says he did it in 7 days, but I think with discussions about it, he can be quick. But you know, he kind of creates lavishly everything, even our DNA is sort of beautifully constructed. However you want to frame that stuff. I just think, you know, that there's an extravagance to creativity that is in itself wonder. And in a world that seems to value as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible, we have to say it's okay for us to be in this space. You know, it's all right for us to be us. In fact, we're needed here. What's the flip side then? What's the cost? I've just mentioned the cost. Well, Sylvia Plath, great poet, says, it's as if neither of us, especially myself, had any skin. I'm afraid I may not be solid, but hollow. She was obviously married to Ted Hughes, another poet laureate. They were very destructive in their relationship, but also incredibly creative. And there was this sort of sense of like, I'm so hollowed out. Emotional sensitivity, low mood, flows of high and low energy, self-doubt, critical narrative, introversion matched with stage persona, rapid stimulation and distraction. Those are the dark sides. They're the difficult sides of what it looks like being a creative person. And I just hope that by naming them, you'll be like, okay, that's the burden. Some of us might like the sort of, the sort of perfect sunshine of the spotless mind idea. That, you know, we're just sort of function, we don't really think that much, we don't feel that much, everything is kind of normal. That would be great. But actually, the upside is feeling a lot, the downside is feeling a lot. You know, as a creative. Like, it's great to have that much color in your head. It's also really sometimes upsetting to have that much color in your head. So it's that whole thing of saying, okay, sometimes I don't sleep that well. You know, that's a reality for creatives. Your mind is working really hard. Sometimes I sleep too well. I can't seem to wake up. It's a reality of being a creative. You know, sometimes my mood is high. That's reality of being a creative. Sometimes my mood is low. And what we've seen through history is that actually these are the realities for all creatives. It's not like anyone gets away with the kind of, you know, limitless idea. Bradley Cooper, you know, take a tablet and somehow you'll be able to put the whole world together and there's no downsides. There's definitely a downside to being a creative. But the success comes through accommodating. This is an American sport, something to do with donkey-based baseball or something like that. But you have to ride donkeys, and I just thought this was quite an amusing image of the guy. He's like, it's definitely not going to win. He's trying to play this game. It's not going to plan. And I feel like sometimes if we try and berate our creative brain about to be more systematic, that's not to say we can't improve our efficiency. And I've been working a lot here on my organization. So I'm notoriously bad at organizing myself, and I've always had an EA or a PA because everyone knows I'm absolutely crap about getting my life together. So coming here to St D's with a smaller team, that's not available to me. I've had to just go, okay, I haven't got the luxury of saying, I can't do this, I need to do this. But also have to recognize I need to work with myself to do it better, which I'm gradually doing. It's about accommodating it, not berating it. So, okay, I've tried lots of different things actually. Tim showed me that actually having a paper diary as a creative is better than having a digital diary, because I can see, you know, my scribblings. That worked for me. That might not be true for you, but I found that some things work. But I've got to accommodate my creative brain, and telling it off doesn't make it work better. So if you're in a battle with your own brain, prepare to lose, like this guy. Because ultimately your brain is deciding what it's going to do and how it's going to work, and you have to either work with it or not work against it because you won't win. living in process is a key part of this. And again, this is Sawyer says, all research shows that the creative process is basically the same, generating ideas, evaluating them and executing them with many creative sparks over time. I found this really, really helpful because as a creative person, if we apply linear or structural approaches to our creativity, we're basically going to lose it. We're trying to be creative in an uncreative way. So I've written a few books, and I've started quite a few books that I've never actually written. And what I've realized is that that's okay. That you can't sit down and go, I'm going to write a book today and write that book. But actually you gather kind of creativity over time, and some things need to rest in the refrigerator and some things need to cook in the oven. And actually, as you kind of go through, you pick up things that actually you think, I'm going to place that there. Now, I used to think, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget all this stuff. But what I've realized is you forget the things that aren't important and you remember the things that are. That's another beauty of the creative brain. It's sort of self-selecting. It tends to have the ability to remember amazing things. Think about some of those really diffuse minority report conversations you're having about your mother-in-law. Like, you pull stuff up from history, it's amazing how much stuff is actually in there and accessible to you. Other people can't access that material. So trusting that your brain can recall the things which are hidden somewhere in the darkness is really, really helpful to you. Living in process is about recognizing that your creativity is not the sum of your next piece of work. It's actually a lifelong journey. And it's really important to sort of take the pressure off. Some of you will think, I want to write a book, or I want to paint a picture, or I want to make a piece of music, or I want to do a dance. But actually, it might not be the right time for the fulfillment of that thing. But feeling like a failure because you haven't done it yet is not actually helping you. But picking up the little creative sparks on the journey in order that at some point in the future that might come to fruition is actually really life-giving. You know, it's a sort of idea of, here I am in process, I'm collecting little moments of inspiration, and they'll all come together at some point. I found it amazing. It was a joy to sort of to be a preacher as a kind of creative experience, because I execute a lot of my creativity in the preparation for my talks, often in the morning when I'm sort of thinking, okay, how can I articulate grace for a 6-year-old kid with a cream egg, which was this morning's activity. But you know, it doesn't need to be something so wow, it's just about living in process and collecting the sparks. And what's weird about sparks is that they can start a fire that isn't them. You know, when you think of the sparks themselves, they're part of something that's greater than itself. So it's not that every kernel is the start of a great idea, but actually when you start generating sparks, there's kind of a fire, and it might be completely disassociated with the spark itself, apart from the fact that there's some sort of creative energy going right there. So not every thought you have is going to be a brilliant idea, but the fact that you're having those kind of thoughts shows that there is an energy creator somewhere in your mind which is going to bring more ideas, and therefore there's going to be something in there of some value. How do we work this out practically? Some of the psychology around how you work is really helpful, because again, systematic linear people tend to work 9 to 5, but the creative brain doesn't actually work 9 to 5. So you're actually much, much more likely to be creative early in the morning, between 6 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., and again between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. than you are within the middle of the day. So many of you will have found this to be true. You wake up and you're like, ping, you've got 1,000 ideas running through your head, you whip out a journal, you're going to take on the day, you're going to like paint a picture, you know, the day is your oyster, you know, you're kind of burbling with stuff as soon as you open your eyes, but the middle of the day feels like dead time. That's when you should go to the bank. That's what we call freewheeling time. You know, go to the bank, you know, do your admin, iron the clothes, whatever it is that you need to do it in the middle of the day. But the beginning of the day and the end of the day are typically the times when we're most diffuse and most creative, which is very annoying for people, because actually the world works around a kind of supposedly 9 to 5 kind of regime. So you're feeling like, but now I've just come alive. One of my friends is a painter, you know, she doesn't really get going until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but then when she's going, she's kind of like a jet plane, and you can't kind of stop her. And her family have to kind of, you know, it's like she's in studio, you know, it's all happening, but it just doesn't, can't you just do it in the middle of the day when everyone's at school, Mum? Well, no, it just doesn't work like that. Who can resonate with that idea? Yeah. So lots of the greats certainly in the arts and in writing, particularly in poetry, have had a morning sort of routine. Got up, Ted Hughes famously used to get up and sort of sit naked in front of his window. I don't know why particularly, but he had a coffee routine, and would kind of get up at sort of 5:30 and sit in the breeze and kind of get cold and have his coffee, and then he would start writing. And actually by 9 o'clock he was kind of done. You can see why people's lifestyle starts getting a bit difficult when you've done your work by 9 a.m. and you don't know what to do with the rest of your day. But there's lots there. There's a lot to kind of acknowledge and go, oh, that's really interesting. Maybe I've got to stop trying to be linear about the day that I'm living, get up earlier, celebrate my creativity, have a great breakfast, do boring stuff, and then be creative again later in the day. Brian, I said that every collaboration helps you to grow, and when you're a creative person, you can be creative with others, and that again propagates the spark. So if you don't feel particularly creative, being around creative people propagate more of this idea of actually how can I generate my creativity. We know that creativity begets creativity. So when you're with people like you, look around the room and be like, if actually I want to do something creative, being with other enabling creatives helps me to be more creative. Because this is part of what permission really looks like. It's saying, actually, these people think like me, and I don't feel like a fool because we're all rolling together, doing something fantastic. Stimulants have always been part of the world of befriending your creative mind, interestingly. And these are legal stimulants. Lots of illegal stimulants have been used. You'll remember particularly the painters who've used the French, so Matisse and friends, who were sort of big absinthe drinkers, and would sort of all their art was sort of rooted in their sort of power of alcohol, particularly that kind of psychologically disturbing alcohol. And obviously, countless artists have been smoking cannabis and taking all sorts of amphetamines and things, over time to try and enable their art. I think, I guess my argument would always be that there's a danger that we become synthetically creative. What's it really mean to be creative if we've sort of enabled our creativity through the use of illegal drugs? There's an argument there. There's probably a counter argument that they're saying that they're releasing their creativity. Obviously, I wouldn't advocate illegal drugs as a means by which you might become more creative. There are three things that I do see in history anyway as being typically powerful for creatives. One is caffeine. And this sounds a bit odd, doesn't it, as a vicar to sort of say caffeine can be good for you. Proust had a sort of 16-bean coffee routine. Beethoven had a bean counting activity. It's really interesting how coffee became a very, very core part of getting going. Now, obviously, caffeine is a stimulant, but I think part of the process was making your coffee was like the entry point or the on-ramp to being creative. So who goes and gets a coffee before they do something? Yeah, great, amazing. So every time I'm going to write something, I go and make a cup of tea. I make a cup of tea, I stand by the kettle, which is very inefficient, I watch it boil, I make my tea, and then I sit down and I almost can't write anything until I've made my tea. And then I will make my tea, and my tea nearly always goes cold because I've written stuff, and then I'll make another tea, but I'll only ever drink about a third of the cup because then it's got cold again, and that's when I know I'm on a flow. And the interruptions of going to the kettle and making another cup of tea actually help me to sort of regroup and then go forward. So caffeine is both a stimulant that helps us to be creative, but the process of counting the beans, grinding the beans, making the coffee, the smell, the range, the pause, they all help us to be creative too. Weirdly, art itself is a stimulant. I think some of the best talks I ever wrote were in the V&A Museum. I used to kind of go across the road from my old church into the V&A, wander around, and just look at stuff, particularly in the sort of plaster cast galleries. And I would sort of wander around. And I felt guilty because I was like, oh, if people saw me in here, they'd think I was just in the V&A, just floating around. And like, that's kind of naughty. But equally, I knew that I could being stimulated by what I was seeing enabled me to kind of think more broadly and really consider what was going on. So art is a stimulant, music is a stimulant, architecture is a stimulant, the environment is a stimulant. So you're getting out and experiencing that level of range. I think, for us as Christians, worship itself is also a huge stimulant. If we're creative because God himself is creative, so when we connect to the heart of God in worship, we're connecting to God, the creator. And that, I feel like, if you want to spend time in creative sparks with anyone, I'd want to spend time with God, because that is like the best encounter for creativity. And if I think about religious art particularly, which is pretty much all art until about 1850, like everything that was painted and designed, if you like, was basically religious art, then that's a lot of creativity right there. If you don't believe me, go to the National and just wander around and just look at, it might not be to your taste, but look around and just see what encounter with God looks like in terms of creativity. Some of the triptychs are just off the chain, and you're like, wow, that is absolutely epic. And that painter, the best painters, had sort of, had encounter. And you probably say that Leonardo da Vinci is probably the best draftsman in history. If you actually look at some of his religious work, you can't disconnect his encounter with God from his drawing. I think it's so revolutionary in its time that it is worship. You just like, okay, I know that there's, obviously, he wasn't like a great pastor or anything, but he was a brilliant, off-the-chain artist. But you see something beautiful about the encounter when you look at his work, and that can only come from God, that level of creativity. Just have a chat. We're going to stop in about 2 or 3 minutes. I've got just a couple more slides, but just a little bit on this. Just have a chat with the person next to you. What do you find helps you to be creative? And any specific things that you find helpful to be more creative? Any ideas that I haven't touched on? Anyone want to offer anything? Anything I've missed? I heard the word procrastination just then. And I would say that there is no such thing as procrastination where creativity is concerned. There's just mental preparation for something amazing. There's definitely, there can be stalling, but stalling and procrastination are slightly different. Stalling is a confidence issue that we're not trusting to put what we want to put out there. But procrastination is often the on-ramp to creativity. And you're not quite ready yet. I think, I'm not quite ready to go yet. And you almost need to get up to that place of energy to be able to go, okay, now I'm ready to go. So again, trying to build to it. There needs to be a sort of almost like a catapult effect with creativity. Like lots of people think exercise is a good way to be creative. It's absolutely not. Because unfortunately, it releases the sort of tension that enables creativity. So if you go out for a great bike ride and then try and write a great talk or paint a great picture, you won't have it in you. Like people, I'll go to the gym first, pretty much kills you creatively, because you're kind of like, I'm done. I'm satisfied. Whereas part of the energy of creativity comes from being dissatisfied. So if you're spent out, if you're like done, you're like, I've had it, okay, I'm great, then you've got nothing. There's sort of something within us, there's a creative tension we talk about, which is like a catapult that's been kind of pulled back, And now I'm releasing something really powerful. Sure, go for a run afterwards, but don't make the mistake of thinking that I need to be in some sort of Zen space to be positively creative. Absolutely not. Creativity comes through that kind of slight tension. And if you can join together the sort of urgency to be creative and physical movement can really help. I find busy body, busy mind. So I like to be in motion. And people say, "Oh, you got ants in your pants," or like you're like a cat on a hot tin roof. Like, yeah, because there's stuff going on in here, and I need to let it go. I need to keep it moving. A few of my friends who are worship leaders, I was asking them about what this looks like. Nick Herbert, who I used to live next door to, he used to say, "Move your brain by half a degree." He has sort of ADHD, and he would throw a tennis ball against the wall, which was really annoying because it was like literally onto my living room. But he would just throw it and like trying to paint and he'd just be always trying to like throw this ball. Sam was saying it's a chrysalis for creativity, a place that stretches you. Again, being with people who sort of stretch you out. And Tim, you have to feel safe. You have to feel right with the right people in the room. So this idea of like being with others who enable you to be creative and support your creativity. We're coming to land, but this idea is also important when we think about caring versus not caring. So why are we creative? And if we care too much about the thing that we're doing, we become potentially successful, popular, marketable, and connected. But the dark side is that we become mainstream, uncreative, dependent, and paranoid. So caring too much about what you actually create, there's more dark side than you think. I think we should be creative for creative's sake, and in a marketable world, the danger is that actually we want to turn our painting into a marketable, kind of Instagrammable event. That the value of what we do creatively is the measurement by which it's received in the public domain. But that's not why we're creative. Because actually that ultimately sort of saturates us and consumes us to the point at which we actually become uncreative. So, how many bands do you know have brought out an incredible first album? Because actually that's when they were truly creative, and it's gone really well, and the record industry said, "Oh, you need to do a second album." How many second albums do you know that have been good? Because they've been created under the pressure of caring too much about whether the public like the second album. It's often the fifth album that kind of comes back and it's like, oh, finally they found themselves again. And that's normally because their career was completely bombing and they didn't really care anymore. When we care too much, that's when we get stuck. So, if you preach and you care too much, you're going to preach badly. If you care what the Lord says, that's great, but don't care what the people think. Just be faithful. That's the kind of key thing where this is working out. If we don't care, you can be highly creative, innovative, rule-breaking, and inspirational, but if you don't care at all, you become disconnected, melancholic, self-absorbed, and addicted, and that also happens to creatives. So there's basically a dark side to not caring at all, and there's a dark side to caring too much, and you have to find yourself somewhere in the middle. You have to say, okay, I don't care so much that it's inhibiting me, but I care enough that it's enabling me. So just think about your creativity and say, well, do I care too much what people think, or do I not care enough? There's no answer to this quandary, but we're always in that battle of thinking, okay, what's happening to me in this? And obviously, there's a creative persona which we can begin to hide behind, which is unhelpful. If we become publicly or successfully creative, we kind of create a mystery around ourselves where no one really knows who we are, and we're just the new cool kind of creative dude, and we start talking in wispy terms about what we do and why we do it and how we do it and how it's all right, untouchable for anyone else. And I just actually that in itself is a road to nowhere, because we just become fraudulent and dependent on others' approval. Increasing our creativity, Gary Fitzgibbon says, that results in a significant rise in well-being. So as opposed to creativity being associated with mental illness, it becomes associated with good mental health. So I want to say to you all, primarily as creative people, being more creative actually will help you to do better. It will help your mental health. And I've been part of sort of art therapy groups. In fact, when I went into psychotherapy, my therapist, the first thing he said to me was, do you paint? I remember thinking, I'm not paying 60 quid to ask me if I paint. Fix me, But sure enough, I got out my paints and started painting, and I found it really helpful. But creativity enables our mental well-being because we're effectively in our own flow, doing what works for us. And as Galatians 6 verse 5 in the message says, that each of us must take responsibility for doing the creative best we can do with our own lives. I think we've got a spiritual mandate to be creative, to express, if you like. We're God's conduits for his creative spirit here on earth. And we might be in the minority, but we need to celebrate our reality and be like, okay, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to participate. Guys, you've been really patient, and I realise our time is up. But I'd love to talk to you more, about this stuff individually. We've come to the end of my little pack of ideas and thoughts. It's a starter for 10. There's a lot to think about there. But I hope it sort of stirs you to both be more self-affirming in your creativity, but also to give you some ideas for how you can develop your creativity and give you more confidence sharing your creative ideas with one another. So, the dream is that there'd be more creative expression here at St D's in different ways. Shall I just pray for us as we close tonight? Jesus, thank you that you are creative, you were creative, you continue to be creative, that you, the Godhead, have created our world. And Lord, you've given us the gift of creativity to point to you, to speak of your wonder. And pray for everyone tonight in this room that they would be more affirmed in their creative mind. Enable us, Lord, to be good stewards of the minds you've given us. Help us to get the very best out of ourselves. And Lord, bless us when we maybe feel insecure about our creativity and the way our mind works. Give us more confidence, Lord, and help us to train our minds and support our creativity, to befriend our creative mind, that we might do more to express your glory in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Thanks so much for your time, everyone, and we will see you soon.